Hi, I'm Rob Hawker. Welcome to the second in my series of videos about data flows. So this one's about the on-premises data gateway. So when might you need the gateway and how might it be relevant to your creation of a new data flow or the editing of an existing data flow. So let's get into the details. I want to start by showing you this standard Microsoft diagram about Power BI gateways just to get us all to the same point. So on the left-hand side here, we've got Power BI Desktop. So many of us will have built semantic models or data sets as they used to be known, and also reports on Power BI Desktop. And when you're doing that, you're on your company's computer within your organization's network, and you've got access to whatever data sources the organization has, from a network perspective at least. Then once you've finished building it on Power BI Desktop, typically what you'll do is publish the report, and it will then be copied effectively into the Power BI service, which is Microsoft Cloud. And at that point, you might want to start refreshing that data, particularly if you're using import instead of direct query. You want your data to be refreshed on a daily or many times per day basis potentially. And to do that, we need to have access to the data sources. Now, some data sources will be cloud-based data sources. So we may have Azure SQL Server, we may have a service like Salesforce providing us with data. And in those cases, there should be a way of connecting Power BI Cloud, Power BI service directly to those other cloud apps. They should be able to talk to each other. In many cases, there will be connectors. But in some cases, the data source is locked behind your company's network. So for example, if you have something that's physically in your own data center and not yet in the cloud, so it's an on-premises data source, that is not directly accessible to the Power BI service, which is in Microsoft's cloud. You would have to use something to help get that data out from your organization's data center and into the Azure world. Now, there are sometimes when a cloud-based data source like Azure SQL Server may be still locked behind your company's security procedures. So maybe your security team or cybersecurity team have put some extra procedures in place to make sure that you can't access the data through these cloud connectors. And then again, you might need the Power BI gateway. So for a semantic model, the only reason we need the gateway is to refresh the data, but actually data flows are a bit different. We build data flows up here in the Power BI service. We don't use Power BI Desktop for that. We have Power Query Online. And so as a result of that, from the very first moment we start trying to build the data flow, we're already needing a way of getting through into the underlying data sources in, say, Azure SQL Server or Salesforce. So what this session's all about is using the gateways in the data flows and how all of that looks. So let's get into it. So next, we're going to go through a simple example that I will then show on the screen. So for this scenario, we're in the Power BI service and we're trying to create a data flow that pulls some data from the SQL Server database on the left-hand side. Now that is actually an Azure SQL Server database, so we could, in theory, avoid the gateway completely because it's cloud to cloud. But for this example, I'm going to simulate the situation where the security teams have layered in some additional security, so you can't do that and you do need the gateway. So we're going to go ahead and use a data source from the gateway. And we've been given a single SQL Server user account, which has got read-only access to the database. And we're going to create a data source, as it's called, on the gateway that reuses that account. And then we'll share that data source with multiple end users so that they would actually be able to go in and create their own data flows. So let's start with an empty Power BI workspace. We're going to come back here later and create our data flow. But before we can do that, the first thing we're going to need to do is just set up our on-premises data gateway so that it can connect to our SQL Server. So here's my organization with its single Power BI gateway or on-premises data gateway. And what that actually is just a virtual machine that I can connect to via remote desktop. And it's just got software installed on it from Microsoft called on-premises data gateway. And all that software is it basically is all the connectors that you would get from Microsoft in Power Query, and it understands therefore when you pass it an M query, a Power Query query, it understands the meaning of that and then what to request from the underlying data source. So that's what this machine is doing. And here's our understanding of that machine up here in the Power BI service. So that machine name PBIGW001 is actually powering a number of different connections here on the connections tab. So we can see there's lots of different connections here that are using that Power BI gateway. So for this one, we're actually going to create a new connection so you can see how that goes. Now, this might be done by the Power BI admin in your organization, but it's good for everyone to understand what's being done. I'm going to come in here and click new. So it asked me to choose a gateway cluster. Now, they're called clusters because you can actually group together multiple virtual machines into one cluster for load balancing and performance point of view. And I'm going to call this Meloro SQL 1. And under here, you'll see all the different connections we could have. So there's all kinds of different sources that we could connect to. And to save myself some time, I'm just going to put SQL Server in here, type it in. And now I have to put my server and database details in. So this is the server and database that I want to connect to. And now I have a choice between a SQL ID, so basic SQL Server ID, Windows authentication, OAuth 2, which is logging on with my Microsoft account, and then finally service principal. So for this demo, I'm going to choose basic, which is just a SQL user created on that server, on that database. But I could put any number of different things in here. There's a number of different options. So for this, I'm just going to type my details in. And we're going to press create. And when we press create, we get a message back with a green tick saying that that's been successfully created. Now, if this username and password was not valid, because we didn't skip the connection test, we would have got an error message up there telling us that it wasn't valid and it wouldn't work. So we know that can definitely log on to the SQL Server database, so that's good. So remember that name, SQL 1, Meloro SQL 1. So now that's configured, we can go back to our gateway example and we can say, let's create a data flow. And we're going to add new tables. Select SQL Server database, and again I'm going to put the details in here. And immediately, as soon as I put those details in, you can see that there's a reaction down here on connection credentials. It comes up with a list of the connections that I have access to. And this one here is the new one that we created, Meloro SQL 1. So when I select Meloro SQL 1, what's happening is it's now reusing the details of that connection that we provided. It's saying, okay, when you go to that server and database, use that username and password. And then it's no longer logging on as me with my account. It's logging on as whatever account I actually maintained in that gateway connection. So now when I click next, it's going to open up the server with whatever access that particular account has to the server. And here's some tables that I have access to. So let's bring a couple in and hit transform data. And here we are. The data is going to be loading now into Power Query for us to transform, do whatever we need to do too. So once we've saved and closed, we have our data flow. So that's great for me. But what if there's a team of another 5 people that need to be able to actually use that source and create their own data flows? Well, actually, what I can do is share that source with that connection with multiple end users. So I can just come in here and search by name or email, and I can add others to this list. I can even add Entra ID groups as well. So let's say I have a group in my organization called Dataflow Developers, which is for all the people that should have access to this source. I could just add that group in here, and all those people, whether it's 5, 10 or 20, will all immediately get access to be able to use this, and they'll all be reusing that same user ID and password. Okay, so time for a quick recap. What did we cover? We covered that Power BI data flows have to be created in the Power BI service, and if the source for that data is either on premises or is behind an additional layer of security, you may need an on-premises data gateway to get to it. We covered how to actually create a data source on that on-premises data gateway, and then how to share that with others in your organization. And we also covered the idea that you might have a single user on that data source, let's say the SQL database, and you might then be able to share that with multiple people in your organization to keep your access model simple and easy to maintain. So thanks very much for listening and hope it was useful.